So in this last chapter, we're going to add two-player support to the game. Now, this may seem like a tricky thing to do, and in a way, it was. So there's going to be a lot of editing to previous scripts that we're going to have to do, and a few little tweaks here and there, and creating the second player prefab as well. So why don't I go ahead and give a preview of what we're going to be working with right now. So I'll maximize this. So the game starts as normal. We have one player, nothing new here, same thing. And then we die. And then the game fades to white and our game over menu comes over. We'll restart the game. But this time, let's add a second player. And here you can see that we have two players working in tandem. We'll restart game, and then we can go back and restart to one player if we wanted to. And of course, I have the penalty amount set to a high value so we can get to the game over screen easier. But as you can see, the second player moves with the arrow keys and fires with the numpad enter key. So you could have two people on the same keyboard playing this game if you wanted. All right, so why don't we see how we can create this? All right, so we got a pretty tall order to do all this stuff, but we'll do it one step at a time. We'll start off by making a player 2 prefab, and we'll give it a unique tag. Then we'll make a new script based on the player 1 mover, and we'll call this player 2 mover with our updated controls that allow us to move with the arrow key. And then we have to make a bullet 2 prefab because our bullets rely on our player's direction. So if we use the same bullet, the bullets would all would all travel based on player 1. So having a second player or a second bullet prefab will allow us to separate the directions in which the bullets will travel. So bullet 1 will travel in the same direction that player 1 was facing, and bullet 2 will travel in the same direction that player 2 was facing. And then we'll have to go in and update our mover script to take into account of player 2's bullet. Then we'll have to go in and update our collision scripts, such as the bullet collision, obstacle collision, power-up collision. I forgot to add it. Then we're going to have to update our player fire function so we can say whether or not player 2 is firing with the enter key and player 1 is firing with the spacebar key. And then we're going to have to give the functionality in our player 2 options menu to be able to select 2-player or 1-player. All right, so let's just jump right into it. And I'm going to move at a decent clip. We're very familiar with the code by now. I mean, we've built the game. So I'm just going to go through and I'll just highlight the key parts of the code and the various scripts that we'll need to edit. But before we can get into editing any code, we have to make some new prefabs, okay? So why don't we go ahead and create a player 2. So with my player selected, I'm going to go ahead and activate my player in my inspector here. And I'm just going to go ahead and hide my UI canvas, so I'll deactivate it. So now I have a clear view of the playing field. And why don't I just zoom in to my player character like so. So I'm just going to select my player and press Control D to duplicate. And let's give him a new name. Let's call him player 2. All right, we're going to go with player 2 selected. Why don't we go ahead and take off our player mover script? We'll just remove that component because we're going to have to give our player 2 a brand new player mover script. Everything else we'll leave as is. And while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and position our players on our battlefield so that they sit together nicely. So I'll move that player up 1 unit, and maybe I'll rotate him 90 degrees in the Y direction, or negative 90 degrees. And for player 2, I'll move him down 1 unit, and let's rotate him 90 degrees. So we have our players facing in opposite directions when we start out. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my prefabs folder down here. I'm going to drag and drop player 2 down here. And now we have a player 2 prefab that we can have stored up if we need to make a new player 2 in the future if it gets deleted or whatnot. All right, so while we're at it, why don't we go ahead and create a second, well, actually, player 2, it needs its own tag now. The regular tag player is not going to cut it anymore. So why don't we make 2 new tags? We'll get ready for bullet. All right, why don't we make player 2 tag and bullet 2 tag. All right, these 2 tags are going to help us separate the differences between our player 1 and player 2 and our different bullets in our scene. And that'll help us access those 2 new prefabs we're making in our code. And then I'll select my player 2 again. And don't forget to update the tag, the player 2 that you just made. And don't forget apply that to the prefab. So now when I go into my players 2 prefab, it's also updated down in there. I'm going to also select my bullet now in my prefabs folder down here. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm just going to call this bullet 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to update its tag to say bullet 2, and we're going to keep the same scripts on here. And before we move on to our code, let's select player 2 again. And you see where my player fire script is located right here. We're going to drag and drop bullet 2 onto bullet object. So now our player 2 will fire his own bullets called bullet 2. All right. So why don't we go ahead and create our new player 2 script. Okay. So I'm going to go to my scripts folder at the bottom of my project window, and I'm going to select player mover, and I'm just going to duplicate player mover, and I'm going to rename it player 2 mover. Now we have to be careful though. We got to open up our player 2 mover script. Make sure you update its class name the first thing you do when you go in here. So now it says player 2 mover, and it coordinates with the new class, the script name we just gave it. And all we're going to do in here now is we're going to change our key codes. So input.get key code. So A is left, so we'll say left arrow. D is right, so we'll say right arrow. W is up, so we'll say up arrow. S is down, so we'll say down arrow. All right, great. And that's all we have to do for this whole script. Okay. We might have gotten away with being able to just keep one player moving script, but I guess we could have done if game object equals player tag player 1, else if player game object equals tag player 2. But I just kept it simple and I kept it quick. And we're just going to have separate scripts for each one of these. All right, so that's it for player mover 2. We're not done with that though. Let's go back to my player 2 prefab in my hierarchy up here. And let's drag and drop player 2 mover over here. And I'm going to move it up. Okay, now we don't want to break that instance. And I'm going to hit apply on the prefab. And that'll update my player 2 prefab down here. So now my player 1 and player 2 have 2 separate mover scripts, and that means they'll have 2 separate shoot directions, which will help keep our bullets firing in their respective directions according to which player is shooting them. So now we have to adjust some scripts here. We'll keep going with that. Let's open up and let's adjust our mover script now. And what we have to do is we have to make sure we're giving our bullet 2 the right move direction based on which player is shooting it. So we're going to make another else if statement. So I'm going to go ahead and copy, and then we'll just paste this new else if. And then we're going to go in and update these key tags and variable names. So if the other game object that is shooting, that is being shot, if its tag equals bullet 2, which is our bullet 2 prefab we just made. And then we're going to we have to access our player 2 game object. So we're going to find a player object will now equal the game object with the tag player 2, which is player 2. And then we have to access the player 2 mover script. So this is what's going to allow our bullets for player 2 and player 1 to travel at different directions. Just updating player 2 mover, the player 2 script, and bullet 2. Very similar. These two LTIFs are very similar, but vastly important. It's going to allow our bullets to travel in the correct directions. So we'll hit Control S to save that. And we'll move on to our next script. So let's go ahead and update our collision scripts. So we'll just go one at a time. We'll update my bullet collision script here. And what we need to do here is we need to make sure that our bullets are still going to ignore all the players. So if the other tag equals player, we also want the bullets to, and if the other tag does not equal player 2. So this will keep our bullets from colliding into both player 1 and player 2. So we're saying if any of the tags don't equal player 1 or player 2, then we will destroy that game object, such as the obstacles, the power-ups, and what have you. And that's all we have to do for our collision bullet script. Just make sure we're ignoring player 2. So moving right along with our collision updates, let's look at collision obstacle now. And all we really have to do here is this line of code says if our obstacle hits a player or hits the boundary, then we're going to shrink the boundary. All right, that's what this whole line of code is more or less in charge of. But we have another player in our game now, so we have to say something like if other tag equals player 2. So we'll keep the ors going, and we'll just add player 2. So what we're saying is if the obstacle is colliding with the player, or if it's colliding with player 2, or if it's colliding with the boundary, then we're going to shrink the boundary field. All right, great. And that's all we have to do for our collision obstacle script. Well, actually, I take that back. We also have to account for our bullets too. So our bullets will be destroyed if our obstacles will be destroyed if they hit bullets. So we have to take into account that we're having a second type of bullet on the player field. So we'll say or other tag equals bullet 2. So this line of code will make sure that our player 2 bullets also destroy our obstacle. All right, great. We are officially done with collision script, I promise this time. So let's move on to my power-up script. And this one's going to be the same thing. We're just kind of updating our tags, right? And what we want to say here is if an obstacle also hits player 2, then we'll queue our power-up script, our power-up function in our game manager class. And that's all we have to do for collision for power-ups. All right, so we're just saying if the power-up collides with a bullet, we get the power-up. If we collide with player 1, we get the power-up. Or if we collide with player 2, we also get the power-up. And the last bit of code we have to go in and edit is our player fire script right here. And this is going to be another easy one to do. And in fact, I'm going to copy and paste this. We'll say if we've hit the key code down, then we'll fire. Or let's see. Really all we have to do is say if we're pressing spacebar or if we're pressing the enter key, then we'll instantiate the bullet. And that may look like it's let's do key code and then what is it? What is it? Keypad enter. There we go. So why does this work so well? Don't we need to designate between player 1 or player 2? Well, you'll remember our player fire script is on each player object here. And since we have different bullet spawn and a different bullet being instantiated and firing from here, So player 1's going to have a bullet 1 to spawn, and it's also going to have its own bullet spawn point out of its own nozzle. And player 2 is going to have a player 2 bullet, or a bullet 2 to spawn, and it'll have its own nozzle to shoot its bullets. So really, we're just looking to see which one we're pressing. I think that'll work. So I'll hit Control S. We'll come back and we'll test it, and we'll see if we can get away with that little bit of code. All right. So why don't we go ahead and test it? All right, so we're moving around with our 2 different players. Perfect. We can't go outside the bounds. Oh, goodness. When I press spacebar, they both fire at the same time. So it looks like we have to go back and add a little bit more to our player fire script. All right, so let's pause that. And it looks like we will have to make a difference here. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this bit of code right here. And I'm going to go ahead and save it down here because I know I'm going to need that little bit in a second. So what we need to do is we need to differentiate between which player is pressing which button. So let's just say if we press the space bar and the game object that we're attached to's tag equals just regular old player. Let's see. Then we'll fire a bullet. So for this to be true, we have to be pressing spacebar, and the other game tag has to be player. All right, and then why don't we'll just copy this bit of code, and we can riff on it. So we'll do an else if for this one, and we won't input keypad enter for this. So I'm just going to repurpose that line of code right there. Just plug it in right there. All right. And then we want to update that to player 2. So we'll say if we press the space bar and our game object is player, then we'll instantiate a bullet. Else if we press the keypad enter key and our game object is player 2, then we'll instantiate that bullet. And that should fix the problem we were just having. So let's test it out. All right, spacebar is only shooting from player 1. And enter key on my numpad is shooting for player 2. And look at this, we have our guys working for us. 2 players are go. All right, great. So all that's left to do, let's bring back my UI canvas. So we got our menu back, and I want to drag and drop my players close to one another, and I'm going to disable player 1, and I'm going to disable player 2, and we're back to kind of where we were at the beginning. There's my player 1, but yet I don't have anything linked to player 2 yet. So we have to give our player 2 option some functionality. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into our game manager function. We'll delete or we'll close out the rest of those scripts. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new public function right under start game right here. We'll call this public void player 2 start game. And we'll get ready to add some code to that in a second. We'll hit Control S. And then after that, why don't we go in and we have to be able to gain access to our player 2 object. So up here, when it says player object, let's do player 2 object. We'll hit Control S. Now let's look at our game manager. So we have player object and player 2 object. Now we have to give player 2 its spot in our game manager. So now we can get access to both player 1 and player 2 in our inspector. All right, great. So now we just have to enable player 2 in our player 2 start game. So we'll say player 2 object dot set active equals true. And then guess what? We don't have to do much more. After we enable player 2, we're going to say, okay, player 2's in the game. Why don't we just do all this code right here? So we'll just call the start game function within our player 2 start game. So what this function is going to do when we click our player 2 button, it's going to activate player 2, and then it's going to call the start game function, which will fade in the overlay. It'll activate player 1. It'll start the coroutine where our obstacles will start spawning in a few seconds, and it'll display our clock and reset our game timer. We'll hit Control S to save. That was a pretty easy player 2 start game function. Now we have to go to our UI canvas, and let's expand our start menu canvas and select the 2-player button. And we'll go to our on-click menu right here. We'll add a new event, all right? And it's very empty right now. So what we need to do is we need to gain access to our player 2 start game function. So we'll drag and drop our game manager right into our empty game object field right there. Now we have to assign it a function. We'll go to Game Manager, where is Player 2 Start Game. There we go. And now that I'm thinking about it, well, why don't we go ahead and just test this theory out? All right. What's the damage on our boundary amount? Let's increase our boundary amount to 2 so we can see the game over screen. We'll press play. Now we'll select the 2-player option, and now both players have entered the field. All right, great. Things look like they're working pretty good. Wait a minute. I still see player 2, and we're getting some error messages right here. So let's fix that. Well, first of all, for some reason in our game manager, our game over screen wasn't attached anymore. So why don't we go ahead and attach our game over screen back there. Oh, wrong one. Game over screen, and then start screen. Secondly, we need to hide our player 2 in our game over function. So we're going to come over to our game manager script, and we're going to find there's our start game, there's our 2-player start game, and here's our game over function. So why don't we just go ahead and say player 2 object set active equals false. And we'll save that. And now everything should function perfectly. So we'll see what happens in the game over screen. Great. We've deactivated player 2 so we don't see him on the game over anymore. And we can restart the game. And we can pick 1 or 2 players again. And since we're basically just reloading our scene, all of our values for everything that we started with get reset. So our boundary gets reset to the same position. Our menus that are hidden get reactivated. And everything basically is just like we're starting the game over, literally fresh for the first time. So we had a little rogue missile make it out before the game over. I think that just happened because we have the penalty value set so high. All right, great. So you know what, guys? That does it for these series of videos. We've covered a lot. We've got a pretty decent functioning game here, and it only took just a little bit. I know we had a few different scripts here, but I think we learned a lot, and we got a solid gameplay experience out of it. All right, so thanks for watching the videos. I hope you guys have enjoyed making this new game, and hope you continue making games into the future.